I am a 20-year veteran in the Forest Service. I've worked as a ranger for 12 years. In all my time working for the government, I mostly never encountered anything too out of the ordinary. That is until my last station job as a ranger at Gooseberry Falls State Park in Minnesota. It was quite possibly one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had while on duty, and certainly not something I'll ever forget. To explain how it happened, we need to go back about 6 months before the incident occurred. I had been planning on retiring, but my son had just graduated college and was looking to move closer to Minneapolis. He asked me if he could work part-time with me, while he looked for a full-time position, so I decided to pass up retirement and stay on the job. By the way, I should make a note that this was all pre-COVID. I had heard rumors of management positions opening up in the area. So, after discussing it with him, we both agreed that he would come back home for around 6 months while he hoped for the perfect job to present itself. I was first introduced to Gooseberry Falls State Park during my orientation as a ranger there, and they took us out into the park at nighttime. It was an amazing sight getting to see all these bright campfires down below from way above on top of the waterfalls. The rocks from the falls are very smooth and slippery due to years and years of erosion. You have to be careful if you want to climb down to view the falls at night. Our group had just finished our tour and was going to head back towards our cars when one of my coworkers, Tom, suggested that we climb down the falls. Just, for the sake of it. I agreed, but we should have known better. And so did a handful of others who were nearby. As soon as we began climbing down, I sensed something wasn't right. But not wanting to look like I chickened out, I pushed those feelings aside as nothing more than nerves. It started out easy, everyone traveling downward in a single file behind each other, staying close and yet far enough apart for safety's sake. Then, around 3/4 of the way down, things began to get a bit more dangerous. Tom fell. I didn't see him go down, but I heard the commotion. One of my other coworkers had seen what had happened, yelling up to us that he needed help getting Tom back up the rocks. 2 guys rushed down to assist in whatever way they could. And while Tom was being helped back up, one of my female friends called out for help above him, saying she was slipping. It turns out that one part of the path she had been on had given way underneath and sent her tumbling downward. While this may have been scary in and of itself, what happened next could only be described as something straight from a horror movie. We were all standing there in shock at what had just happened when I heard the sound of movement above. I looked up, and there at the top of the ridge was this figure with long dark hair watching us. It was terrifying. It was all in black and had these faint yellow glowing eyes. It was in that moment that I felt my entire body give way, as if I suddenly lost control. The next thing I knew, I too was falling down to the ground below me. Everybody rushed over to help save me, and one guy managed to grab hold of my hand while another wrapped his arms around one leg for whatever little good that did. They tried pulling me back up, but there was no use. I looked down below and I could see there were people trying to help Tom, though they weren't having much success. I felt then that there was a possibility that we were going to die right there on those rocks if somebody didn't do something fast. That's when I remember the park ranger telling us about one of the waterfalls in this area being called Lucifer Falls. But for some reason, nobody had ever been able to locate it if they ever climbed down to view it at night. It was said that once you get close enough, you could hear voices, supposedly spirits whispering your name from below. Now, what is most troubling about this story is not so much what happened to me and my coworkers, but what happened with Tom and the female friend. As they were being pulled back up to safety before either of them could make it out of the water completely, we noticed that their eyes had turned from their normal state into a solid black. It was at this moment that my 2 coworkers realized that the people they were struggling to help weren't actually Tom or the girl. I'll never forget hearing one of the others in the group scream as he pointed downwards towards, whatever it was that our friends had turned into. And yet another guy who was just in front of Tom and his girlfriend jumped back down into the water below to avoid capture. We watched them swim off in the opposite direction, but by this time, there was nothing we could do to save them. We never did find out what happened to any of them after that day. I can only assume they were captured and are now being used as some sort of test subjects or something by these demonic creatures. Just looking at my own hands now, I can still see the scars on them from that day. That's why I'm warning you all not to venture down this path at night. As a matter of fact, it might be best just to stay away from these woods entirely during nighttime hours, like we should have. Whatever it is that inhabits these lands does not seem too keen on having people wandering around here at night. But if you do, be careful, for you may soon find that the woods themselves can't tell the difference between friend and foe. I was spending the summer living out of a tent in a Michigan state park. I know that sounds bad. I had a job that summer, but I was going through some things and couldn't afford any decent housing close enough to work. I didn't have a car at the time, so I was limited to places I could bike to and from work. Luckily, the park was close enough and they gave me a discount on a long-term campsite. If I'm honest, the park facilities were a lot nicer than some of the apartments I looked at in town. I mean, public showers definitely weren't my favorite, but I could have done worse that year. The park was pretty nice. Most of it was wooded. There were 2 lakes and 3 campgrounds. 2 of the campgrounds were near the 2 lakes, and the third was situated between where the forest met a small prairie. This was the campground I set up in. There was enough shade from the trees nearby, and I'd get the breeze rolling off the open prairie. Plus, it was a little quieter than the campsites, but the lake. There was a marshy area just beyond the prairie that brought out some bugs, but nothing a citronella candle couldn't take care of. It was a pretty nice setup. I liked it. Living there, I got to know the park staff pretty well. So when something was up, I could tell. I heard about a couple of campers that had issues with a deer, believe it or not. Apparently it tried to break through their tent in the middle of the night. They could hear hoofbeats outside and saw the shape of antlers ramming the tent fabric. I wasn't quite sure what to make of that, but I never had any problems. There was also someone carving strange runes into trees in random places, but we all just attributed that to some people being weirdos. There was a reward out for any information leading to the culprits, since carving up trees at the state park was technically vandalism. It wasn't a big reward, but I was hard up for cash that year, so I did some sleuthing around, but I didn't find anything. Other than that, I myself didn't see anything strange, but the park staff knew something they didn't want to talk about. I asked around and none of them would give details, but just said there had been encounters. Encounters with what? I don't know. They wouldn't tell me. Some weeks they would close certain sections of the campgrounds or certain trails. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. They did permanently close the trail leading to the marsh, but with all the mosquitoes over there, I don't think anybody missed it. I finally asked what was going on, and they said they had been having some issues with wildlife. But like I said, I had gotten to know these people pretty well, and I knew they were lying. I went to the ranger I knew the best and asked point blank, was it safe for me to stay in the park? He said honestly that he didn't know. No one had been injured, but people had been reporting seeing strange beings. They were having a team come in later that week and test the area for anything that might make people hallucinate, because the stories they were telling them were all absolutely insane. But every story had one thing in common. There was something evil living in the marsh. He said everyone described it a little different, but they all said it came out of the marsh. I tried pressing him for more information, but I could tell he just didn't know what to say to me. A team of scientists did come and test the area when I was there. They asked me a whole bunch of questions since I had been staying there long term, but nothing came of it. They didn't find anything. It was about a week later that the park ranger came and told me they needed to close the park for 1, maybe 2 days, and that I had to find somewhere else to go during that time. Well, I didn't have anywhere else to go, and I was saving for a car, so I didn't want to blow any money on a hotel. I know this is bad, but I decided to stash my bike nearby and camp off trail and just hope I wouldn't get caught. I found a spot close enough to the road that I could hike in and out from there to get to work, but it was hidden enough that I thought no one would see me. I did have to pass the marsh, but I wasn't too worried about it. I should have been, but I wasn't. It was pretty late by the time I finished my shift, and I had to bike in after dark. I didn't want to use my flashlight in case any of the rangers were there overnight for some reason. They wouldn't say why they were closing the park, but I assumed something was going on. There were several black vans in parking lot by the main office when I left. Retelling this story out loud, I feel like such an idiot. I should have known something was out there, and that I should have just listened to the ranger, but I was young and dumb and thought I'd be fine. I made it safely back to my camp in the dark, but just as I got there, I heard something scream. It wasn't a human sound, and it was coming from the direction of the marsh. I saw lights on the hill and heard human voices nearby. I crawled through the grass towards them to see what was going on. It took me a while to get there, but I made it all the way to the marsh without being seen. There were at least a dozen men in tactical gear, like bulletproof vests and guns. They didn't have any type of uniform that I recognized. They were surrounding the marsh with spotlights pointed towards it. It was quiet for a moment before something moved under the water. The only thing I could see was what looked like the points of deer antlers poking out of the swamp. The moved like it was swimming underwater, and suddenly the men with guns all open fired. It was so bright, I thought I saw daylight for a second. Everything went quiet again. Two of the men waded into the water to retrieve whatever they had shot to pieces. I don't even know how to describe it. They pulled it out with a rope. It looked like a person, but had the antlers of a deer. Its limbs were long, too long to be human, and its fingers looked like claws. Its face was pretty shot up, but it looked like it had a snout at one point. I have no idea what it was or what to even compare it to. The park opened as usual the next day. The black vehicles were nowhere to be seen, and the marsh trail was open to the public again. I asked the ranger why the park had been closed, and he told me that the scientists found some chemical in the marsh that had been making people hallucinate, and they had to neutralize it. He reassured me the park was safe again, and that was that. I wanted to ask more questions, but I was sure he would have told me I had hallucinated the whole thing, but I can tell you for certain that those were no scientists treating some chemical in the marsh. They buried it. Not physically, you know, but they did everything in their power to make sure that the thing I saw was forgotten. I haven't forgotten. I guess they're just counting on the fact that no one is going to believe my story. So far, they've been right. Nothing haunts me more than that. Not the encounter itself, not the aftermath. What haunts me is knowing that no matter what, my truth will always be considered a lie. That encounter is such a big part of me now. You might as well call my entire life these days a fabrication. The nightmares, the cold sweats, the distrust. Is all of it a lie? And for what? Do you think I thrive on the looks I get when the details start to slip out? You think I enjoy being called crazy? You think I liked watching my family and friends turn their backs on me? I didn't. But I know who did. The same government bodies who came out to help me. The same ones who said they were there to save my life, to record my story and ensure that I'd be heard. I can't tell you exactly who they were. I'm sure you can piece it together. I string the wrong sequence of keywords together, though, and they'll be knocking at my door at 2 a.m. I'd rather not deal with them again. The phone calls and the cars following me home from the grocery store are enough interference for me. I don't need any more. When I was still with the Park Service, I thought it made me part of something. I thought it meant I was on the same team as the rest of the government, contributing to making this country something beautiful. I thought it meant I'd have allies. I was an idiot then. One afternoon, on a sweltering but insignificant day, I came across an abandoned campsite. Everyone had checked out of the park as far as I knew, and there were no reports of squatters in the area. I checked our records, and sure enough, someone had been there. They'd left that morning, though. Left in a hurry, I guess. I sorted my way through the damage to find out why. I had to tally up the details after all. Figure out how big of a fine they'd be looking at for leaving so much of their property and debris behind in our park. But as I was lifting the lip of a tossed backpack, Something growled nearby. It wasn't a bear or a big cat. It wasn't a wild dog or a wolf. I knew what those calls sounded like. This was different. It was deeper. It felt heavy, seeping in through my ears and weighing down my brain with dread. It pushed my usual bravery down into the dirt. I swallowed the nerves building in my throat and turned to search the tree line. I had to face it, right? Much to my surprise, the growl hadn't come from an animal. It had come from a man. There was a man in those trees, standing close to 7 feet tall. That was enough to dwarf me. I was already prepared to run. His wardrobe is what gave me pause. He was dressed in something like a ghillie suit. Those things snipers wear, you know? They lay down in the earth and completely disappear. This one looked like hair. Wiry ropes of reddish-orange fibers draped every inch of his body, concealed his face almost completely. I could barely make out the flat nose and cracked lips that made up his lower face. The skin there was deeply wrinkled. It had to be a costume, right? I only doubted that when it roared. It bellowed at me and started to move forward. Something deep in my bones, call it instincts or fight or flight, whatever. Some deep part of me knew I had to leave. I had to run. Clear out of there and save my own skin before I got wrapped up in whatever had come wandering out of the woods. And I got out of there safely. Not a scratch on me. Does that make the story worse somehow? I called my superiors and reported what I saw, continuing to insist that it was just a man. I tried to get in contact with the camper who had left that site in the morning. I still haven't heard from them. It was a different agency who got back to me, the same ones I mentioned at the start. They wrote down all the details, assured me that what I had to say was important, and then they disappeared. My job disappeared with them. Word got around that I was delusional, unsafe, and insubordinate. I don't know where those stories came from, but I do know that they stuck. I was blacklisted in some way. I couldn't return to any stretch of government work. I couldn't contact my former peers who avoided me like I had the plague. And the more I pushed, the more the agents came back around. The cars in my rearview mirror, the heavy breathing on the other end of the phone. It's like they want to keep me paranoid. They want to keep me rattled. They want my life to be just as unbelievable as it was that day in the woods. The longer they keep me on edge, the more I talk about the phone tap and the black vehicles, the less reliable I become. Suddenly I've imagined it all. There's no one following me. There's no one calling. And that means there couldn't have been someone in the park that day, right? That means whatever I saw probably didn't exist. When those realizations sink in, the result is always the same. Whoever's listening starts to laugh. I don't blame them, though. That's the deep part of them, isn't it? It's easier to disregard the story than it is to believe it. After all, what if I was wrong? What if that hadn't been a man at all? What if it was something else? All right, let me tell you about this crazy mission I went on in Ecuador. We were a small group of Army Special Forces soldiers sent on a top-secret operation to gather intel on some mysterious facility. The place was surrounded by barbed wire fences, and what caught our attention right away was the Russian flag waving proudly on one of the buildings. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. As we approached the facility, we couldn't help but notice something strange lurking inside. There was this massive creature, like nothing any of us had ever seen before. Picture an 8-foot-tall dog, but standing on its hind legs. It was muscular, with the kind of build that reminded me of a werewolf from those old horror movies. Yeah, that's exactly what it looked like. Now, our orders were crystal clear. Take photos of whatever was going on in there, but under no circumstances were we to engage with the creature or anyone else. But let me tell you, curiosity got the better of us. We couldn't just ignore this strange beast and the whole operation happening right under our noses. We quietly moved closer, making sure not to alert anyone. It was nerve-wracking, to say the least. The adrenaline was pumping through our veins as we snapped photos of the facility and the creature. We had to document everything, even though we had no clue what it all meant. But then, the unexpected happened. One of my comrades accidentally stepped on a twig, snapping it like a firecracker. Instantly, all hell broke loose. The creature's head snapped towards us, its glowing eyes fixed on our group. It let out a bone-chilling growl that echoed through the night. We were frozen for a moment, but instinct kicked in, and we scrambled to retreat. The creature charged at us, its powerful strides closing the gap with terrifying speed. Bullets whizzed past, but it seemed invulnerable, shrugging off our shots like they were nothing. Fear surged through my veins as I ran, heart pounding in my chest. We needed to find cover, and fast. We ducked behind some crates, desperately trying to catch our breath. The creature circled us, snarling, its sharp teeth glistening in the moonlight. It felt like an eternity, but eventually we managed to escape. We made it back to our extraction point, battered and bruised, but with the most crucial evidence, the photos. Our mission was complete, but the questions kept haunting us. What was that creature? What were the Russians doing with it? That night in Ecuador will forever be etched in my memory. The encounter with that monstrous creature, the rush of adrenaline, and the lingering mysteries left behind. It was like stepping into a real-life horror story, one that I'll never forget. And trust me, it's a story I won't be sharing around a campfire anytime soon. I don't quite know how to say this, so I'm just going to come out and say it. I saw something the other day in the swamp that just confused the utter dickens out of me. There are two reasons that I like to go to the swamps. One, because I like to row through it and enjoy nature as it is supposed to be. Two, because I am part of a neighborhood watch. I'm not sure what to call it, but I basically go out and look for animals that are in danger and try to keep some animals away from poachers if I can. On one of my trips out, I noticed something lying in the way, off the side of the river, that looked like it may have been injured. It was laying on its side, partially on the bank and partially in the water. I thought it might have been killed by something or it was injured from something. I rowed off to the side of it and got out of my boat. I grabbed my snare pole out of the back and used the handle end to nudge the animal to see if it might have been resting, but it didn't move. Now that I was closer, it looked like it was a young crocodile, maybe only 5 months old. Well, the weird thing is, down here in America, we don't have crocodiles. We have alligators, so this looked very weird to me. I got my snare around where I thought its head would be, and I pulled it out of the water so it could breathe. When I saw that it wasn't an alligator or a crocodile, I don't know if I can describe it quite right, but it looked like a dog. Like a crocodile dog. I know that sounds weird, but that's what it looked like. It had the ears of a dog, the eyes of a dog, and a snout that quite resembled more of a crocodilian-looking thing, except it had the trademark teeth of a crocodile. It was hideous looking. I also noticed that it had huge claws, and it had a mixture of fern scales. What the hell, I thought. Was this some sort of science experiment gone wrong? Its body was green, but again, it looked and kind of resembled a dog, a very thick-skinned kind of animal. It was very hideous. Its mouth was hanging open too, like as if it was panting. I took the snare off it and climbed back into the boat. I grabbed a beef jerky stick out of my backpack and opened it. I stayed in the boat, but I threw it towards the thing to see if the smell of meat would wake it up. I saw its nose twitching from the smell. It moved its head sideways to eat it. Whatever it was still very weak and small and frail, but I didn't know why. I grabbed my water and got back out of the boat. I slowly poured the water near it so it could drink. Normally, I think I should be terrified by whatever this thing was, but it was injured and in a state that was almost near death. I checked its body for any kind of wound, and I saw that it had a gunshot on its side. It was then that this creature, whatever it was, began to act very aggressive towards me, and almost coming back to life the closer I got to it. It started snapping at me and getting very lively all of a sudden. Maybe it was best that I stepped back into my boat, I thought. And so I did, and this thing started to become much more aggressive and hostile in nature, almost beginning to gain its strength back in a sort of a second wind or something. That's when it started to try and stand up on 2 legs, even though this thing was tiny, frail, and clearly hurt or injured. It didn't like that I was trying to help it, even though I didn't care that this thing looked like a failed science experiment. It was in my inner best heart that I wanted to see this thing brought back to health, no matter how hideous it was or unnatural it was. Again, I've never seen a creature like this before, but the second it started acting aggressive and trying to attack me with as little strength as it had, that's when I realized I should get out of there. And so I did. As I'm kind of pulling away, this thing seemed to regain its strength so fast and finally pursued me by jumping back in the water, swimming towards me. Listen, I know this sounds crazy and all, and normally I would tell you you're crazy if it did. This thing only seemed to pursue me for a little while after I got on my boat and then disappeared underneath the water for good. I still think about it because this wasn't that long ago, and it was very weird. I've talked to some of my friends about it and other people who are in my Animal Neighborhood Watch group, and nobody seems to know exactly what I'm talking about, or they think I'm making up the story. Anyway, believe me if you will, but this is my true sighting of something I would consider strange and unknown, and possibly paranormal. The only thing I don't quite understand is why it was so frail and weak and floating under the water half on the shore, like it was yanked out of somewhere and thrown on its side, left to die and then shot. Maybe it was stunned. Again, I don't really know. I'm just trying to get answers for all these questions that I have. Who really knows? Is it possible that this really was a science experiment and was pulled out here in the swamps and shot, left to die because it was a failed creation? That is something that haunts me still to this day.